Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Give it another minute or so for folks to show up. If you haven't put your name in the attendees list, I'll be merging pull requests as they come in. I see a couple just showed up in the last few minutes, so I'm going to go through those while we wait for the rest of the folks to show.
Hello.
Hello, hello. We're just waiting a minute or so for attendee lists. And if your name isn't on the agenda attendee list, please feel free to send a pull request. I'll merge in a few of those as they come in just in these next few minutes, but I'll clean up the rest after the meeting. All right, participant list looks pretty stable. I made it through all of the PRs that were just up. They're not in any specific order this time, but that's okay. All right, welcome folks to the last working group meeting of the year. I've got the agendas up for the first 3 of next year, and at some point later this week, I'm going to add in a handful for the rest of the year. Plan is to kind of stick with the schedule that we've had so far, first Thursdays of the month. Unless that's an issue for anyone, or if there's specific dates along there that look problematic, just feel free to let me know about them. Quick overview of our agenda. Actually, let's just start from the top as we usually do. So thanks everybody for joining. Of course, by joining here, we all agree to the membership agreement, the participation guidelines, and the code of conduct. Just a usual thing at the top. There's links there if you forget what's in those, but just a reminder that we have those there. And let's get to the intro of the attendees. Hopefully, I think almost everybody here is a familiar face, maybe a couple new folks. So it's always good to get names to faces, especially for people who watch the videos of these afterwards. So let's use the attendee list order in the agenda. If you refresh that, I've merged a couple pull requests. So you'll see the latest list there. I'm at the top. So hey everybody, my name is Lee, and I'll hand it to see James has not joined yet, so Michael. Michael, you're muted.
No, better?
Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Michael Stipe. I'm with Chili Cream and we are building the .NET implementation of GraphQL called Hot Chocolate.
I think I'm up next, Dan Schaefer, and I'm at Facebook.
I'm Matt Mahoney, also at Facebook on the client side.
Hi, I'm Benji. I work on PostGraphQL and various other open source things and have a few spec things to discuss today.
Hi, I'm Evan. I work on GraphQL at Shopify.
Hi everyone, I'm Yogesh. I'm joining from Pune. This is first meeting. I'm working for Tokopedia from last 3 years on this GraphQL adoption.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark. I work at GraphQL. Sorry, I work on GraphQL at Yelp, and I'm here to discuss schema coordinates.
Hey everybody, good morning from Sydney. My name is Andy. I work at GraphQL Java and at Lessing.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I hope to maintain GraphQL.js, Express GraphQL, and some other foundation projects.
Hi, my name is Alan Shah. I work for IBM Research. I'm working on GraphQL management as well as some open source libraries related to GraphQL.
Hey, I'm Sasha. I work at Twitter and I'm just going to be a fly on the wall today.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm the CEO and founder of Elemental and one of the GraphQL co-creators along with Lee and Dan. And I, like Sasha, will be a fly on the wall mostly and here in my capacity as a member of the technical steering committee, which Lee may be able to give some more context on. I assume you were going to mention that.
That's our list. Yeah, I think we talked about that last time, so hopefully everyone is familiar with that. But the folks who are on our TSC, anytime we have something that needs an official vote rather than just me ruling by dictum, we now have a group of people who can chime in, which is a good thing. And it forces Nick to attend our meeting and hang out with us. Well, thanks. This is a solid crew. I see, as per usual, Benji has volunteered to take notes. I have that doc open and I see Benji's already outlined our agenda in there. Is anyone willing to also pitch in, especially while Benji is in discussion?
Yeah, I can cover notes while Benji is talking.
Awesome, thank you, Mark. Okay, a quick look through of the rest of our agenda. We have 4 major topics today. One from Benji talking about the Dunder type name at subscription root. From Mark talking about schema coordinates. Another from Benji on default value coercion. And then I've moved the discussing previous meeting action items to the end of the meeting. Usually we do that at the beginning, but we've got a little bit of a backlog and Benji's going to help us kind of churn through that all. So I figured it might be best to save that for the last. Anything else you all want to talk about while we're all here that's not on this agenda?
I wanted to call for another meeting of the GraphQL Input Unions Working Group.
Sounds good. We'll get something on the books.
Cool.
Yeah, I want to suggest we have like a stage 3 feature for forbidding circular input fields. I will send the link in a minute. And it's related to Benji PR about like input coercion of default values in some ways. And I think like we we released it in reference implementation a long time, so maybe we can add and quickly discuss it and merge it.
Sounds good. If you want to put that on the agenda, we can also talk about that today. I see Andy mentioned that we should give Benji a gift for taking notes for so long. I agree. We'll figure out a way to do that for sure. Note champion. Okay, let's jump in at the top. Benji, this first one is yours. Dunder type name.
Yeah, okay, so we discussed this previously. Basically, it's not valid at the moment. Like you can't, it validates, so I shouldn't say valid. If you put dunder type name in a subscription operation, it validates, but it will never give you a good result because dunder type name does not return a async iterator. So basically it's always going to give you an error. It also causes confusion with various bits of tooling that think that they can safely add it at the top of the subscription operation in addition to whatever field it is, whatever subscription field you wish to add. So I discovered this whilst working on the query ambiguity stuff, and I wanted to basically make it explicitly clear rather than an accidental issue. I wanted to just explicitly state that this isn't valid. So what I've proposed is that we do that with a slight modification to the spec, which I've outlined. I outlined previously, got some feedback, and I've re-implemented it. So it's now part of the validation rule where it says that one field, there may only be one field on the subscription operation. Now it says there can only be one field, and that field must not be an introspection field, basically. And that is it. It's quite a small change. So my main aim would be to gather feedback, to see what people think, and maybe to move this. I have done a basic implementation in GraphQL.js, but I believe that there is some issues that I need to talk to Ivan about, and I haven't had a chance yet. So that will come later.
So my initial instinct when I heard it was like, that's weird. That makes the subscription object act different than other objects. But the subscription object already is different than other objects. It like takes you into async land. You can only have one field on it. I was like thinking, being like, what does like dunder type name return for subscription? Should that? What does it even mean to return? This feels right to me. I don't think, honestly, like the fact that you only have one field on a subscription object feels off to me to begin with. But that's there, and I don't think that adds anything else. This feels right to me. Also, good catch.
Benji's our resident deep reader of the spec. I feel like you found the most weird quirks so far. Any dissenting opinions on this, or like what's the cost of making this change?
Hi, Yaakov here. Just found out actually about this meeting. Probably should have registered in advance. I've been working on the GraphQL tools repository. I think it's really great to really point this out as explicit. I ran into this as a bug where end users were expecting this to work, and or my implementation of query wrapping was expecting this to work, and it doesn't. So it's good to make it explicit. I think it's fine to change the spec now to match the implementation, but I think better would be to change the implementation to match the spec. I don't think it harms anybody to allow type name to be used, and there's, there is a use case for it if you want to get a fully typed response that's a little bit more easy to automate. I think in the future we might want to consider allowing multiple fields in subscriptions if there's a pathway for that going forward. I think it makes sense to start with just one, as it's complicated enough, but it doesn't seem to me to be well, it seems to me to be ideal for the spec to match the implementation one way or the other, but going forward, it's again, it's a small thing, and it seems like it can't hurt to actually allow it to work.
Well, I guess we'd have to decide what it would even mean for it to work. So
Well, it
there's
would
already,
just return the name of the type. I mean, that's usually subscription. It can be customized. I mean, it's the same thing as the type of any of, query a mutation. It works for those and might as well work for subscription. I mean, just my 2 cents.
yeah, part of why it's quirky here and why the subscription type in particular is weird is that all of those fields don't return values, but they return async iterators or streams of values. And the type name is I guess you could model that one as a special edge case where that one does in fact return a stream of string that's only yields one value. But there's also this.
It would just be ignored during the first run through, and then when it gets resolved, I think it would work. It would work there. But I do have to think about it more. But I think that would work.
So I think long term, it likely makes sense for us to like rethink subscriptions and figure out how to have multiple root fields on them, but because that brings subscriptions more in line with everything else. But given we don't allow that, and it would probably be a gnarly project to do that, bringing the spec in line with current expectations and just saying type name that doesn't actually make sense on subscription as we originally wrote it feels more right than the current state.
I definitely agree the current state is inconsistent. What if, I'm not sure if I did have time, but if I had time to try to get an implementation working where it was, worked and was able to donate that time, would that be something people would be interested in seeing? I myself, I'm not sure if I fully thought it through, but I think it could work as a special case. If that's something people would be interested in, I'd be willing to work on it, I think, if I had time. But if not, it's not the largest of deals, there are workarounds.
It could be interesting. Part of the challenge here is that we'll have to make sure that this makes sense for all implementations, and not just the reference implementation. So I'd want to make sure that if we were going to follow that path, that it's something that would be viable for many. And would the idea be that this would be another, like we'd also describe the edge case, but we'd describe it in a different way, where right now the existing spec says that field set has to have exactly one entry. So presumably you could have a subscription which asks for one entry, and that entry is type name. It's probably not a particularly helpful query to write, which I think is why Benji is proposing blocking it. And we'd have to caveat that with must have exactly one entry, except if it's an introspection field. Is that what you're proposing, Yakov?
Pretty much. We would just be allowing just the introspection field. Or really just, I'm thinking just type name. I'm actually not so familiar. Are there other introspection fields that make sense on a subscription?
I think that's the only one that's allowed in that particular place at present.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's harder for me because of my familiarity is with TypeScript much more than Flow. But I'd be willing to give it a go. And if it's not, it might be very gnarly. But if it's not too gnarly, just be a nice comparison maybe to what Benji's already worked on to bring the spec. To bring the implementation in line with the spec, and then we could choose going forward. Like I said, there are workarounds. I don't prefer them. I prefer it working, but whatever.
I can clarify a bit. As I understand, we limit subscription to one field because it's one event stream. So like if we have two fields, if we subscribe to two fields, it's like two event streams. But in spec, we write that subscription is like two parts. One part is to register for subscription. Another part is every event for event stream should pass through, basically through execute. You pass event and you resolve all the stuff deeper. So for this phase, we already have, we should have schema anyway. So if we have schema Anyway, on event resolution time, we can provide introspection free fields for free. There is no like in that sense, all introspection fields are all top-level introspection fields are special because they don't have a subscribe and they're not associated with event stream. So I would say a trade-off for allowing what Yakov proposing is that we change a rule, we make it a little bit more complex, saying like instead of having exactly one field, we say exactly one non-introspection field, and we have clear definition of what introspection and non-introspection fields in a spec. But we say a bunch of Yakov created PR for GraphQL tools for like work around this limitation. And basically, if we enforce it, every new client, every new, like many new libraries need to work around the fact that you cannot query type name. Like through entire GraphQL ecosystem, it's like de facto standard for, especially for schemaless like clients to inject type names on every level. So basically, people need to add like a bunch of workarounds. We make it harder for them. So it's like trade-off: either we like make a little bit more complex validation rule, or we add like special handling of subscription in every in many GraphQL clients. So I'm for adding stuff that Yakov proposing. But to be clear, Benji proposing is like resolution of ambiguity, and what this alternative proposal is like adding kind of new feature, because core issue was about forbidding just underscore type name. Allowing underscore type name in addition to fields, it's like a new feature.
That's a really good point, and it actually makes it clear that we're not really faced with an either or situation here. We could actually continue ahead with what Benji's proposing, because it's always safe to go from something not being allowed to something being allowed, but the other way around is not safe. So we can start by resolving the ambiguity, and then follow up Yakov with an actual proposal that allows a case that actually currently is not allowed, right? Like you can't add two fields in that
I would
selection
agree
set.
with that. Even though the spec says it's kind of allowed, everyone, you know, Benji's is probably the first one to discover it, you know, serendipitously at pretty much the same time as I ran into the bug. So I would agree with that. It's totally okay. I mean, personally, from my perspective, totally okay to just bring the spec back into line and then look at this as a change, you know, to change what I'm proposing, or really what was proposed just now much more eloquently. As I would agree with that as a feature request. I would totally agree.
Awesome. Okay, that sounds like a viable path forward. Anybody have any problems with that path?
Just to clear, Yakov, you volunteering to be champion for this proposal, so you will actually submit it against repo, right? And
well,
I can help with
I mean, I would right now, I guess, I think we're talking about Benji moving forward to make the validation rule match current behavior. And then the spec would be clarified to match that. And then once that's all through, we would start over again to brainstorm. I mean, I was interested only in the type name, but I think I would agree with you, Ivan, that all the introspection fields, based on what you were saying, would make sense to be valid.
I'm pretty sure the under type name is the only introspection field that would be valid in that spot. Asking for schema is only allowed on the query type. That one's already pretty clear. So I think it would make sense that we wouldn't extend that one into the subscription field. I don't think you need to wait, by the way, for this change from Benji to kind of make its way through the paces. If this is something that you think is the right thing to do, then you should champion it and write up a proposal or hack together something in a reference implementation to test it out to see if it's worth the complexity cost. especially if we're now looking at these as two separate things, one resolving an ambiguity and one adding new capabilities.
Okay. My schedule depending. But
Yep,
anyway, I appreciate Benji for clarifying this, because having that issue in the back of my mind when someone put that bug report in, that was very, very actually helpful.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Yeah, just to comment further, as you say, it's all to do with the one field, literally the query that only has the type name in it. I think what you're proposing at the moment with the allowing also the dunder type name to be added opens the door for multiple fields, and then that brings about the hydra that is what happens when we have multiple event streams. Does the dunder type name, does it actually return an event stream rather than a string? Is it a special field that's treated differently and gets merged into the result without invoking those dragons? I think there's a lot of questions to resolve there.
I think it has to be, it has to not touch that hydra, otherwise it's doomed. Merging event streams. I mean, maybe eventually we want to get there. Matt was mentioning we might want to get there, but that's a much bigger effort. Merging those streams is both it's actually from the spec point of view, probably not that hard, but like making sure that the reference implementations aren't overburdening themselves by offering that capability. There's like the core principle of not allowing things which are inefficient by default, right? And so that's a potential, that's part of the why that one is really hard. I dropped a link to the part of the spec on resolving subscriptions. I do think, just like a thought on how we might go about building this, you could probably pull the source. Part of the reason why we limit that selection set to 1 is it just makes it really easy to pull the event stream out. You could imagine, adjusting that algorithm where you first ignore the introspection fields and then require there's only one remaining non-introspection field, and that's your event stream. And then mapping those events back to payloads, you just would treat dunder type name like any other field. I don't know if that's actually how it would map through in the reference implementation, but that's my intuition on how that one would work out.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, cool. Sounds like we have a good path forward for that one. Benji, it looks like you've already gone through some details on the actual spec changes itself there. So I'll give you a post review there. It's likely that we can pass this. It doesn't have any RFC label yet. We'll at least give it RFC 1, but we'll offline it. It might be able to go straight to RFC 2.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, moving on. Mark, to you to talk about updates on schema coordinates.
Ooh, thank you. Yes, so for those unfamiliar, the elevator pitch here is, that thing in GraphQL or Apollo Studio where you hover over a thing in the document and it says that the name field on the user type written as user.name, like those things. So we use them everywhere, but there's no formal specification or name for that. So that's what the spec proposal is doing. And we're calling them schema coordinates. So yeah, I've been coming to these meetings for a few months now, and there's been a lot of discussion on the spec edits and the RFC. So those are now 2 pull requests. And thank you so much to everyone who has kind of dived into those. And I know Benji and Lee have spent a lot of time looking into those as well. So thank you there as well. It's kind of looking like we're at a dotting the I's and crossing the T's kind of phase. And now, yeah, there was one specific thing that I came here to talk about as well. So in the PR, we had some discussion over when we want to refer to arguments in a field, kind of what that syntax should look like. So I guess maybe I'll give a bit of introduction just to set up that discussion. So let's say you have a search users, field in the roots query objects. So you might have query.search users, and then search users is going to take a parameter, right? So maybe the argument is called name, and that takes a stringy value. So schema coordinates allow you to refer to that argument and not just the field. So you could write query.search users, and you might also want to do query.search users, and then the spec edit proposes query.search users open brackets name colon. But there's another scholarly school of thought that says we might want to refer to that as query.search users dot name. So that's what we're discussing today. Yeah, for the record, I'm relatively, I can go either way here. I want to do what makes sense to most people. I like the fact that the curly, the parentheses kind of looks like what's in the schema, and it slightly makes it less ambiguous that you're referring to arguments specifically and not just like a directive or something else. But yeah, I'm totally happy to kind of hear what people's thoughts are.
So I can jump in a little bit because I've been the one mostly arguing for the full dots representation here, just because in the way that my brain is parsing this, these feel like a list, and using different separators for different parts of a list just seems unnecessary. But Benji also provided a really interesting example in the GitHub comments of where that could be ambiguous. So I think I'm coming around a little bit to using parentheses, although I'm still not a fan of what that colon is doing there, honestly.
What was the original rationale for the colon? I remember we were discussing this maybe 2 meetings ago. Was it so that we had a future path to, if we wanted to refer to multiple arguments simultaneously, that we could list them both there and we had a clear delineator?
Yeah, there was some galaxy brain thing going on that we might be able to do that. And also it looked a bit like Swift, which we all liked as well. Yeah, again, I'm relatively unopinionated there. But something future capability never seems like a bad idea.
I mean, if we want to list multiple arguments there, then I would think a comma would be more appropriate, because that's already what we use in GraphQL for delineating multiple arguments.
Kind of. Commas are weird in GraphQL.
Yeah, space also works.
I know I was busting a cache recently by just appending more and more commas to the end of my query. It was fun and weird.
When I had a lot of opposition to the idea of commas being not a part of the real grammar. They just exist as a magical separator entity. And someone in our team.
By what Lee means is that I didn't like it, I think is the precise thing.
I wasn't actually talking about you, but you also gave me some good shit for it. But so right after it landed, someone made comment blocks at the top of our GraphQL documents in ASCII art using commas and commas alone. So that,
was that Scott?
That was definitely Scott Walchuk. And that was a very good troll. It was in ASCII art. Commas are great as like first, 200 lines of the GraphQL query. So there you go.
Yeah, I think also that
ASCII art. Sorry, Mark.
No, sorry. For the record, I'll go on record. I like commas as well, but yeah, that seems like something that a future proposal could wrangle, because right now we are only talking about the one argument that you might want to refer to. If you had like multiple arguments, then like commas obviously, visually make sense as a delimiter. You can look at that. I guess, again, some original thinking was that the colon is a concept that indicates this is a parameter in other languages like Swift. So maybe that's why we have it, just to kind of further reduce ambiguity. Again, because like maybe it's the name of the directive or something. I don't know.
That is part of the reason why I like it. It makes it a little less ambiguous. Like it doesn't look like a value being passed to a function that's being called. It clearly stands out as something a little bit different, which makes you stop and think like, wait, what is it I'm looking at? It makes it more clear that you're referring to the left side of that colon rather than the right side of that colon.
Right.
And I kind of like the pedagogical nature of it, kind of like indicating that it is it highlights the syntax that you would see in both the query and the schema. That's part of the reason why I like it. Which I guess kind of speaks to the use case. Like if we only really care about these as like a terse way to refer to points within a schema, then actually dot path is the tersest way to do that. There's like fewer typings on the keyboard to do that. But if we're thinking about these as generated and then displayed back to people so that they can understand reference points, then legibility is more important than typability, which my sense is where most of the motivating use cases are here, is that these can show up in documentation or in error reports or in things where for someone who might not be familiar with the concept, they should be able to look at this and kind of like intuitively understand what it is that it's referring to.
Yeah, to be honest, most of the places that we've ended up using, like referencing parts of the schema, we've ended up doing so with paths into a query or a response rather than schema coordinates. And so, like, I know those are very closely related things, but we've been trying to keep them separate because they are separate things. That's, I think, maybe the other thing that I like about dots is that it's very easy to kind of extend it arbitrarily long into a full path, where the parentheses and colons make that a little, I mean, it's still possible. It just looks a little weirder if you've got colon dot.
Another wrinkle maybe. So in the screenshot that I shared of the GraphQL like docs search tab thing, that actually will show you the type of a thing. So when you type in like user and it shows you query.user, it actually displays like query.user : string, I believe. So there's already some sort of like weirdness there that like GraphQL might have to figure out visually. It might need to change its UI. Yeah, just, I don't know, I guess that's kind of relevant. Might be another tick in the pro dot separator column.
That's interesting. Actually, I came to the separate conclusion on that one, because this I think gets back to what Benji was commenting on in that thread, which is if you just use the dots, then you don't have a separator to indicate if the thing that comes after that is referring to the argument or referring to the return type. And so when you have type.field : type, that makes it clear that you're referring to the return value of that. But if you add another dot in there, then it's like, are you following a path to a return type, or are you talking about the type that argument accepts? Which is maybe a reason to include at least the parentheses part of this. And then I guess if you were going to include the type, then you definitely would want that colon there. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need it for the limited schema coordinate use case.
Yeah, I don't think what I said is a blocker for the record. Like you could just have another colon, or the UI could use an arrow, or I mean, I guess that would be weird. Yeah, I don't think it's a blocker, but just like an interesting kind of is what the use cases we're talking about are actually doing today.
So one of the things that I'm trying to keep in mind for this is this is a spec for schema coordinates and it should address schema coordinates specifically, but we should keep in mind that others might want to extend on this syntax in future. So I think if we can make it a syntax that we can expand for other use cases, we should do so, which is why I've pushed back Evan quite heavily on the dots. I don't know what the use cases are, and to be honest, the ones that I've come up with so far haven't been that great, but you know, we've only been talking about this for a few months, and who knows what someone's going to come up with in 2 years' time.
Yeah, I'm fine with parentheses. I think parentheses and alone, and we can leave the colon and like sub dot stuff for a second wave of discussion, leaves us in a pretty good spot. At least I see a path forward for all of the use cases I want out of this. So
I'd still propose keeping the trailing colon just for its ability to put it in front of someone and be a little bit more clear about what it is that they're looking at. Like it does nothing for the interpretability of that thing, right? Like it's purely there as a tool for someone to look at this and make it clear that this is not a value being passed in, but this is the left-hand side of where a value be passed in. I do think, you know, for this group of people, we are super well versed in this stuff. It's going to be obvious to us, and that feels like noise. My intuition is that for the vast majority of users of a GraphQL system who see these things for the first time, a little detail like that will be the difference between kind of understanding what's being referred to and being confused, and hopefully not being confused in a way that causes them to lead to a different conclusion.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how the colon then lets us expand this further into paths in the future, because you kind of end up with this weird colon just sitting in the middle of your argument path. Or yeah, that's the direction that I want to go in with this eventually, because that's what Shopify is already using it for, basically. Yeah, the colon, I mean, it's not an unsolvable problem. It just starts to feel a little awkward.
Just to clarify about Shopify use case. So you're starting from point in schema, and for example, argument, and you want to point something inside input objects, deep inside input objects. In that case, can you do like a call stack, basically like number of array of strings starting from arguments, then add like a first like input field, next input field, next input field. I think it would be more clear in a sense for user, because you're starting from something that is clearly typed, and you just follow with like field names without like type names. So I would like advocate that if we restrict to schema coordinates, we can have arrays of such strings.
Yeah, I can expand a little bit on our use case right now, which is we have a tool that shows our third-party clients when they're using a deprecated input. And right now we give them basically actually what Benji put in. That's actually a really nice syntax, Benji. I like that. Mutation.doThing, and then in parentheses input.user.name : right now we do a slight variation on that to show them which part of the input that they're using has been deprecated that they need to change. You know, we could do that as like a plain array of JSON strings of the path in, but that just starts to feel a little ugly. I like right now actually we just do plain dots. So we just write mutation.doThing.input.user.name. And that's unambiguous because we never refer to a second field. We only refer to like type.field. As many arguments as we need into the input path. But I do like the parentheses version for that. If we can then dot the inputs beforehand.
So you need some delineator between what you're referring to as the argument and what you're referring to as the path into the input object, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking when we were talking about the colon, I was thinking that the colon, we would use the colon as a delimiter there, which gets really weird. But actually just using dots for that inside the parentheses, as Benji put in the chat, is quite a nice pattern for me.
Cool.
Okay, I'm sold.
It seems like there's still a little bit of detail on how we want this to land, but at least we're directionally aligned, which is good. And I know we've used a little bit more time than we said we would in the agenda. So let's follow up. If we need a little subcommittee meeting to kind of like hash out the last details of this, we can do that. But let's see how far we can get, just sort of like working it through in the actual RFC. We've made a lot of progress there in the last month, just in time between these two meetings. So hopefully we can do the same.
Can I just bike shed one more thing for 30 seconds?
Yeah.
So when I was writing the RFC, I spent like 80% of the time I wrote schema coordinates. I actually just wrote schema selectors instead. And then like, oh shit, no, we renamed it schema coordinates. So we landed at coordinates because that's kind of what GraphQL Java did, like field coordinates, and it feels right. But looking at it now, I'm just wondering if someone outside of this group was to look at this like schema coordinates, that's a weird name. Do we want something just like a little bit more flashy, or I don't know. I'm super not tied to schema coordinates as a name for this, and if there's something more intuitive like schema selectors that people prefer, I think that could make sense.
I'm not tied to the name at all. I have no idea how we would decide which is the best fit. I feel like we should throw like a poll up on Twitter or something and see if people react to it. But yeah, I'm all about the bike shedding. We should come up with other ideas. If you keep finding yourself thinking about it as schema selector, then this is your proposal, man. Rename it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll think about it then. Cheers.
Yeah, one thing about it, I think if we currently, it's more like schema coordinates because you're not selecting, you're pointing to a stuff. But if we in future want to go the route that Shopify is using, it's like it's selectors, because we don't point to exact input field. We're like selecting it based on a field and path from a field inside the argument. So if we go there, I would say like we should call it selector from the beginning.
Mm. Yeah, maybe
I think one of the interesting things about the schema coordinates at the moment is that there is a one-to-one mapping. Like every entity in the GraphQL schema has exactly one name, whereas when you have the more path style that Shopify are using, then you're effectively referring to a field on an input type or something like that through a path, which is a perfectly valid thing to do, but it's a different meaning to what we've got here. So I think that we could have schema coordinates and have schema selectors, and they could even use a very similar syntax, but the schema coordinates that we have currently are really like the one-to-one mapping.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I'm sold.
All right, well, we'll hash out the last details of this offline, and then we'll pull together if we need to talk about something together. But I want to make sure we make it through the rest of the things we've got. But thanks for walking us through this, Mark. I feel like we've made steady progress. Next up, Benji, default value coercion. This one I feel like is going to be fun.
Oh my word. Yeah, okay. So here's the thing. I was looking through the GraphQL spec, and feel like this is how all my stories start. There's some interesting things that go on with default value everywhere. really. One of the interesting things, Nick nodding knowingly. One of the interesting things is I would expect, I'm not sure, let me specifically share my screen rather than putting it here in the webcam.
What software are you using, by the way, to do your side-by-side?
OBS.
It's a nice trick.
All right. Are you seeing, you should just be seeing the Firefox window. Cool. So basically, if we have a schema like this, a simple schema that has query, has an example field on query that takes an input object, that input object has a default, which is the empty object, and it references this input type, which is a number field, which also has a default. When you look at this and you look at these queries, I think that you would expect them all to have the same result. So if we take this one, this is the most fleshed out one. So we take the example, we pass in the input object, and we pass into it a number of 3. Number of 3 here is the default, which goes in there. That's like the fully specified version that doesn't use defaults. If we write a query that does this, where we just pass in an object, then it seems to me that the number 3 default here should apply. So that should work just fine as well. But then when, and then also with example, again, the same thing should happen. And further, if you were to use defaults that were coming through the operation defaults as well, you would expect, I think, all of these to have the same result. It turns out that the later 3 all have the same result, but this first one does not. And the reason for that is that this value is passed at runtime and has then the defaults applied to it. Whereas the field here, if we don't pass an input object value to it, then it uses what is defined in the schema as what is resolved at the time that the schema is defined, which is literally, well, to be honest, it isn't actually resolved. It just uses literally that value. You could put the number 7 there and it would use the number 7, which doesn't actually conform to the schema. I'm not sure if that's strictly true, but I think it is at the moment. So this seems like a problem to me. This definitely seems like an issue. I thought at first that we could solve this by just, you know, just coercing it, but it's not that simple. There is significant complexity around this, which broadly comes from the fact that these things can be recursive, right? Input objects can refer to other input objects, and they can have default values that refer to themselves. So when a user specifies something, we know what the concrete value of that is. So we don't, because of the way that we use just the value as it currently is, we don't get that kind of recursive issue. But my main issue is this doesn't do what the user expects. It definitely feels to me like a bug. It feels like a bug in the spec. So what I've proposed is this. We make a spec change to it that effectively says, sorry, bear with me. So that effectively says that the default value would get validated as if it was supplied by the user at runtime. So effectively, we want to treat the default here as if it were fed in by the user here. So the way that I've written this into the spec is that it actually takes place during the execution process. So we've just changed where if there is a default value, then coerce it at that point and use the coerced default value rather than the default value itself. But I want to stress that this doesn't actually have to be done at execution time. We can do this at schema build time and memoize it. Another thing to note about it is I think it would make sense to users if you set the default to be an empty object, that it shows up in introspection as an empty object and doesn't show up in introspection as being, for example, an object with the number equals 3 inside of it. So that's broadly what we're talking about here. There is complexity here. So yeah, I have a proposal. What do you think?
I agree that this is problematic. I don't know if I agree yet that this is the right way to solve it, but this doesn't seem quite right. So part of the reason, there were a couple of reasons why default values did not go through coercion. And in fact, we had like a pretty major overhaul of the default value system, I think 2 years ago, if I remember right. That introduced the ability to kind of even create this pattern. And one was we wanted to make sure that they were statically knowable. So you did not have to actually perform an execution in order to know what the default values are going to be within a query. The other, and I think Yvonne mentioned this on the thread, was that you should be able to read the query, right? Queries, schemas are written to be read. And if you see that default value and it looks like an empty object, then you might be confused when you find on the other side, in fact, it was not an empty object, but an object that had a number field in it because the type of that thing had a default. Now there's definitely a twist here, which is either that means that we have to repeat ourselves or that it means that we have to kind of leave this or follow something that you proposed, right? So an alternate proposal here would be, there is a step, you mentioned maybe you could just pass straight up the number 7 and that's what you would get. You can't do that because there is a validation rule that says the default value must be a valid value of the type. And 7 is not a valid example input object in this particular case. The empty object is passing as that because this number field has a default and therefore it's not required to be passed. And so this is certainly a bug where in this particular case, it's deemed as a valid type, even though this particular case is not being coerced. And so it's missing a step. With that said, you look at this, maybe another way you could get around this is say, there's a different kind of validation that we do specifically for these default values, and that requires that all values that are required are provided, regardless of whether or not they contain default values, essentially requiring manual coercion at the schema write time. Downside of that would be, imagine you have 3 examples that all use example input object. All 3 of them say there's a number :3 in there because that's the default. And then later someone decides, oh, actually the default shouldn't be 3, the default should be 30. And then they forget to update the other ones. So they update the input object type, but don't update the other ones. So there's a maintenance risk there. And so there's a trade-off between being able to kind of immediately see what you're passing in versus what you get. I don't know if that's better than what you're proposing here, but I wanted to at least toss that out as a alternate potential solution.
So I wanted to comment on what you said about seeing what the default would be from a user expectation point of view. You mentioned if you see that the object is an empty object, it would potentially be confusing if it were then to actually be an object that has the number 3 in it. I'd like to challenge that to start with. So I don't think it would be confusing because it's effectively saying, if you don't specify this, it is the same as if you were to type empty object. And that's what I would expect from a default value. And that is what it is doing. I don't think it is necessary for it to have all those extra things in. And I think that actually having those extra things in may be more confusing depending on how deep it goes. because they're like, well, why has it got all these things in there? And also, what happens if I then specify it, but I only give it one of those properties? Are those other two properties still there or not? The fact that it can default to something that is different from the defaults of the children is desirable, but we want to make that explicit. The other thing is, there seems to be a tooling issue. So even if introspection says the default of this is an empty object, tooling can still say, but the resolved value of it would be an object with number 3. And I think that's perfectly valid. And I think it's actually what GraphQL does currently, because I have set the default value to be the empty object. And in GraphQL, it still shows up as value with number 3. So I'm not sure if I did something wrong or whether that is the case. But yeah, that seems like that's an issue beyond the actual introspection itself. That's a display issue. So to my mind, we should make it do what people would expect it to do if you just passed in an empty object. It should be the same as the user typing an empty object.
That mental model makes a lot of sense to me, that if you typed this in, that you will get exactly the same behavior as that default value. If you copied that default value and put it into your query, you should get exactly the same thing, where right now you clearly are not. And so that's obviously an issue. Other folks have thoughts on this one?
I have some thoughts, and like, obviously it's an issue because number as typed in the schema provided is non-nullable, and clearly, like, at runtime, at execution time, it ends up null. So very clearly something is broken. Like, the client has overridden the server contract in, or like the server in client handshake is broken. So that seems obvious. We like that needs to be fixed. I also think the idea that an empty input object means that the fields provided have a default does make sense, because like, we need a way for you to specify some fields, but then say the server can decide the rest. And like, you need a way for that to always be true. My intuition here is the best way is, yeah, have example always, or have the example with no input object be the same as example with an input object set to empty.
So what Benji is proposing.
Yeah.
I want to add this, definitely looking at the area that I think GraphQL Java does. But, well, you can argue
Andreas, I
GraphQL
can't really hear. I don't think I can really hear you very well. You sound a bit underwater.
Andy, I think you might have a mic problem. Hopefully Andy can fix this mic issue.
Oh, maybe you can write in chat.
Yep.
In the meantime, I think that this is a non-breaking change because, as you say, Lee, we have to have already put those values in place for the schemas to currently be valid, those default values. So keeping those existing ones, this shouldn't change that because they should still coerce the same. So I think it's a non-breaking change.
Yvonne, you mentioned in the thread here that you have some concerns with this. Do you want to talk through those?
Yeah, so one thing I need to research, and I think it's important. So like current behavior for defaults for query variables. Is it like, if I remember correctly, I need to check it, but if I remember correctly, in spec, we don't coerce default values of query variables. So, and if so, we cannot change this behavior. In that sense, like we already have two types of default, like we already have like different. So like if we don't coerce query variables, default values, but we coerce default values of execute of SDL inside SDL. So I think it will be, it's not, and we cannot change coercion of query variables. It needs to be researched. I'm not sure about that.
We do though. This query, for example, I'm not sure you can see it, but query D in the issue 793 is the pull request against the GraphQL spec. It has a default of an example object that has a default with the empty object, and the result of that is still the expected value with the default applied. So I believe that the defaults for query variables do get coerced.
Yeah, like as you point out in my research, in GraphQL.js, I think we do that, but in spec we don't do that. If I need to check, like, but stuff that I'm totally sure about as potential problem is that coercion rules for scalars. So we're discussing mostly coercion rules for objects. So like adding default values. But there is like two other type of coercion rules. We have rules for arrays, converting one element to array, which is also not problematic. But what's problematic is coercion rules for standard scalars, not standard for scalars, and the implementation defined. We even have like input coercion for ID type, and its implementation defined. So it's a GraphQL server can, if it's decide to, it can convert like numbers to IDs. So it's recommended, it's not required. In that sense, by applying coercion rules to default values, so like if we send through introspection, if we send non-coerced values that is expect to be coerced during execution, it means like server or client whose ability to like expand this value on a client, because for expanding scalars you need to have like scalar implementation. But if we, so I think like there is two issues in one PRs in this PR, and we can handle them separately. One thing is that value is not validated at all, and it's like really bad. And second thing is like coercion. I'm like totally for validating thing. If like if we expect, I don't know, if we expect a string and somebody pass number, we forbid for string scalar, we forbid coercion from number to string, but like technically, according to a spec, you can write it in SDL, nothing prevent you from doing it. So I'm fading like validation, so that default value should match against value. But I'm like, I'm not sure about applying coercion. So I'm for validation, but not sure about coercion.
Can you hear me now better? Okay. I just want to say it's definitely a problematic area, and I agree we have to do something about it. I think GraphQL Java doesn't implement it exactly in the way as GraphQL.js does. So it's just in general not easy to implement correctly and to implement it even in the same way. I'm not sure about the consequences of what Benji proposes so far, because yeah, first I need to do more homework and to read more stuff up for myself, but also just a general comment. What I don't really like is the implicit nature of the default values kind of creeping up to you. You define an empty thing, and then suddenly there's a default value in it defined totally somewhere else. It kind of breaks a little bit the boring mental model, the good and boring mental model of GraphQL, that you kind of just read it and know what's going on. We are very explicit with interfaces, implementing interfaces, for example, where we prefer repetition over kind of schema. You need to read the schema and then you jump to another place and find out this interface implements another thing. So that's just one example where we prefer boring repetition and over kind of implicit things, and this kind of breaks here. I'm not sure we can get around of this, to be honest, because repeating everywhere is also comes with problems, as Lee pointed out and Benji pointed out. So yeah, something we have to continue thinking about. Specifically, the default value for custom scalars is problematic. Like I pasted an example into the chat. If you have a custom scalar, a complex custom scalar like JSON, like basically an type system escape hatch, right? It can be any literal, and what it does and what it means to the scalar is totally up to the implementation. So there's not really like a general coercion rule you can apply to this. So yeah, not really a solution, but more problems maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think it's part of why my intuition was to go towards repetition, is thinking back to those previous cases. There is a meaningful difference here, though, that with the interfaces, implementing interfaces, we preferred repetition because it made things easier to read, and validation made it so that we didn't have the maintenance problem. If you made a mistake, validation, schema validation would fail, and it would make it pretty obvious that you had to complete that migration. But for default values, it's not. It's like there could be a meaningful difference if your local default is a different value. Maybe that was intentional, maybe that was different, and we have to leave space for that. And repetition makes that possibility go away. Matt, do you want to say more about this DevX issue that you mentioned in the chat?
Yeah, so thinking through this is actually like, I know, at least from what I understand, we almost never use schema level default variables or default values. And primarily we do that because, well, like the actual the actual code on the server can decide what the default is and can modify it if you just pass in a null, right? So it, from a DevX standpoint, like if I have a variable and I want to say, I want the server to decide what this default value is. If the server schema for that argument has defined a default value of 3 and I pass in null, I want that to end up being that server, I want it to be equivalent probably to the server defined default of 3. But that doesn't happen at the GraphQL, like that doesn't get resolved at the GraphQL level. Whereas the default values kind of assume that your server is telling you what the default will be. It's not a breaking change, I don't believe, for a server to update a default value, which leads to kind of weird, like, I can't say sometimes when I send this query, I want to use the server GraphQL defined default value. And sometimes, even if that updates in the future, and sometimes I want to specify it manually. Whereas with queries, with query defaults, we can do that by just not sending like, oh, I just don't include that query variable in when I send it to the server.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have it set up such that null is a real value. Omission is what results in the default showing up.
Yeah.
Null is null.
Yeah, so there's no way as a variable to end up with the default for a scalar, but there sort of is with input object.
Except by omitting it, not sending the variable at all, you'll get the default.
Really? Wait, not sending the variable, I thought that's different than, okay, yeah, that seems very surprising that would just be coerced.
I think that becomes that's just an error if you don't send a value for the variable.
You can leave out a variable if it's non-nullable, if I remember correctly. Sorry, if it's nullable. So
if it's optional, you can leave it out. And the two ways it can be optional is if it's nullable, in which case it just defaults to null, or if it has a default value, in which case it will be the default value.
But there's no way, even if I leave that variable out, if I have an argument that I like, if I have an argument set to that variable.
And the variable is not present, then the default value of this variable will be used.
Oh, okay.
But I think this discussion between us already shows that this is highly non-trivial. Like if we have problems in our model, in our head to come up with solutions, like I don't want to think about people who don't spend so much time on GraphQL. So
yep.
Yeah, like one fundamental goal, regardless of what we do, should be like simplifying or not maximizing confusion. Like this should be like some secondary or like primary goal of whatever we do at the moment, because it's really complicated, as we just found out.
That was actually very much one of my goals of this, was to make the simplest solution that I could, which is why I've not written anything about memoization actually into the spec, and I've just basically copied the same coercion algorithm that you already have for values here and just applied it to default values here. So it is very straightforward to do it. If you were to do it this way in execution, then you wouldn't be getting the performance that you could if you were to memoize, but the actual spec doesn't really care about that. So I think very much simplicity is a goal of this, and you can see the number of changes in this RFC are quite small.
There's two different algorithms, one for coercing argument values and one for coercing variable values. They're very similar. They have notes below each of them that cross-link because they are similar. But there are distinct differences just because of the presence of an argument kind of changes things. I'm pretty sure your change only changes the coercion of variable values because that's where this issue presented itself. But I feel like we should double check that there isn't issues across both algorithms, because both of them end up managing the relationship between provided values and default values.
It does both argument values and variable values, I think, now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, your pull request does?
Yeah, I've certainly got changes in the coerce argument values algorithm, so I think so. The argument values is really the one that needs fixing, I think.
Oh, you did. I think I just misread your pull request. So yeah, I think you have the same change in both places. Cool. Seems like this is probably the right path forward. It's we should kind of consider this a important problem to solve relatively quickly for the reason that Matt pointed out, which is this essentially breaks the contract between client and server in a way that's potentially a security issue. Not the things that can get leaked, but if you kind of know about this is a potential vulnerability and your server is poorly built, you could cause a crash. So this makes it possible that the server believes that a value will not be null, and you can provide it such that a null will appear and therefore potentially create an NPE. And if your server doesn't handle NPEs well, then you could like create a load issue or create an outage issue. So this seems like an important thing, at least for folks to go like gut check that this is not an actual vuln for your servers that can take things down. But at least theoretically, it seems like it could be, and therefore it should be reasonably high priority that we come up with a fix. My suggestion for next steps is to actually write this into some of the implementations. It seems like Andy has an idea of where this might land within GraphQL.js. Maybe Yvonne, you can take a look at this on the JS side. Matt, you might want to take a look at this in the internal Facebook server, just to see kind of like if these behaviors are spec compliant and exhibit this bug, or if they are not. And there already seems to be kind of quirkiness with the example that you provided, Benji, in the query D in your write-up. Actually seems like it's not behaving the way that, like the way the spec is written, it sounds like that one should actually be returning a null. Or maybe I'm just kind of misunderstanding.
I think that's what Ivan was saying actually, is that the spec doesn't say that it should be coerced, but GraphQL.js actually does coerce it.
Yeah.
Which is
So
why
I'm
the
curious
spec
if
has the fix in both locations.
So I'm glad that it has the fix in both locations. It means that in one case there's an issue with the spec, if not both cases, and there's also a incompatibility between spec and reference implementation. So my sense is the next step here is to get at least a GraphQL.js pull request up that illustrates this, and then probably also making it clear that we can avoid the recursion problem that you framed up. I don't know that I totally understand the recursion problem quite yet. Maybe reference implementation and a test will help us tease out potential recursion issues. And we also probably want to make sure that we can do this in a way that is in fact memoizable, that there isn't some like lurking issue that's keeping us from being able to do that.
To clarify, we actually have ambiguity in the spec itself, not only GraphQL.js, but in the spec. Remember, we already have a bug with default values of null that you fixed like a year or 2 years ago, I think. So you removed a special validation rule for default values. So right now, validation rule is to apply coercion rules. So we don't have like validation rules. We have like only coercion. So when we check every value in query, we check that it's coerced or something. We don't check it's like validate, and it's for every literal. So for default value of query variables, we validated use the coercion rules. But during the execution, we don't apply coercion rules. So it's already ambiguity inside the spec. So I'm not sure, but I think like one thing we can do is to clarify as much as possible stuff like without adding a feature that we don't sure about, like coercion. Like maybe for next time I will work on like alternative proposal to just add validation, just without coercion, and we will see how it's implemented in GraphQL.js and what's simpler and how it affects spec.
So one potential, like it doesn't fix the mismatch of expectations, which is what I think the biggest issue for me with this is. But one potential way to solve this is with a schema validation rule that is a bit deeper than our current one. As you say, it currently says that it must be coercible to the value, but that's not enough. We need to say not only is it coercible to the value, but also that when it is used, it will be valid against all the like non-null constraints and all those other things. I'm not sure exactly how we would say that, but I feel like that is actually probably going to be a bigger change to the GraphQL spec than this would be. And to me, this is the more desired outcome. Like when I'm writing my GraphQL schema, I want to write this parameter will be the same as passing an empty object because that's what I want it to be the same as for the user. I've got my default values elsewhere. I don't care so much about those. Like GraphQL should handle that for me. So that's how I feel about it.
Like a related question, what does the introspection return as default value for the argument here? Is this, did anybody look into this?
Yeah, it for what I've got here, it returns, I believe, the empty object, which is what you would expect.
Really?
I mean, yeah, it's an invalid, this isn't really a valid schema. It's how we define schemas at the moment. This is not a valid schema because the default value doesn't get coerced. So technically, the default value should have an object with number :3 as the default value. And it's up to the schema writer to make sure that that is the case. But that introspection returns for default value what you have said is the default value, to me, is the correct behavior.
Yeah, I think introspection is doing the right thing here, which is if you say the default value is an empty object, then introspection should tell you that the default value is an empty object. I think the way that you framed this in the proposal is the right one, which is this is really a property of execution, which is converting that default value into a realized value. And that is a missing step. And we can still do that and memoize it, but I don't, my sense is that it would probably be the wrong thing to return the coerced value from introspection rather than the value as written in the schema.
I actually started writing up an implementation of this and then stopped because I realized it was a bit more complex and we couldn't just store the coerced value. One reason is you would want the so in GraphQL.js, where you can get the schema definition from the API, you would want that to come back out as what you fed in. So you would want to get that empty object back out again. And if we do the coercion and we store that, and that's what comes out of introspection, then the description of the API wouldn't be the same as what we fed in. Effectively, I'd want the same out of the SDL that describes the schema as what I wrote in as the SDL that describes the schema.
I think this, not directly related to this, but I think this is a fundamental problem of how introspection default values are defined. I think introspection default values are just a string, and you actually define here in not a string value, an AST value, like it's like an AST literal. So you already always have some kind of conversion happening here, which is especially relevant for custom scalars, where you can have like very complex AST literals, and you kind of need to convert it to string value for the default value, which is non-trivial sometimes.
This becomes more pointed also in languages that are not JavaScript, where like in the schema definition in Ruby, the default value you pass in is not a GraphQL object or a JavaScript object or anything. It's a Ruby object, and then the schema has to know how to kind of convert that into the SDL and also coerce it sort of although in practice it just passes the Ruby object in. It doesn't like convert it into the SDL and then coerce that and then pass that in. It just passes the Ruby object right in because that was what you wanted to pass in the first place.
Yeah, this is actually an open issue in GraphQL Java and GraphQL JS, that you actually need and want an additional coercion method to do this conversion, because you don't have at runtime, you can have a schema which is not defined at all as SDL, as Evan said. So you have to have kind of a method to convert a default value, which is not at all represented in SDL, back into a string. Like this, I copied the GraphQL JS issue, which talks about converting arbitrary scalar values into ASTs and back. I'm not sure how much related it is to this problem, honestly, but it feels it could be in some way, because we are talking here about default values. So you could actually set the default value outside of the SDL.
Yeah, ideally, all defaults can be represented in both ways. But defining it first in the native environment and then backtracking to a GraphQL literal is not always straightforward. But I do think that's a slightly separate problem. Okay, I think we can move on. It's clear that we want to fix this. I marked it as stage 1 on this proposal, because this proposed direction seems directionally like what we think is the right thing, and we need to kind of implement it to double check that we've covered all of the bases we want to cover. Seems like we have, but we might find some extra iteration there before we get to stage 2. But let's make this one a priority to fix. It seems like a real concerning issue. Thanks for catching this, Benji.
Yeah, no worries. I think there might be a bit of a gap in validation in the spec as it currently stands. So Lee, if I could borrow a bit of your time and pick your brains about it later at some point, whenever's convenient, that would be very helpful.
For sure.
Awesome.
Okay, next up we have action item review. Benji, you had some thoughts on how we would lead this, so I'll actually let you take a first cut through these.
Before that, I submitted PR to add like item to agenda. It's like quick item, and it's actually help with one. So okay. Yeah, so I think like 2 years ago, community member proposed to limit recursion on input types. And we agree with it. The only objection was from James, because he was concerned that we not allowing circular input objects, basically. But we decided to still go with it, and we merged it. And it's already 1 year, more than a year since it was released. So, and nobody complained, nobody opened an issue, and nobody like report anything. At least I'm not aware of it. So I suggest like just merge it, since it's already a year. Plus, is kind of related to like this thing about coercion, because if we, so right now default values use as is, and there is no like coercion. But if we start coercion stuff, like I'm personally for writing coercion algorithm, because right now we don't have it. We have like coercion algorithm which like use default values, only one layer. So we have like coercion of args, but we don't specify how it's coerced deeply. And I think like by accepting this PR, we make our life easier for like Benji's PR, or for specifying validation of input values or like collection of input values in general.
If we can't do recursive input objects, then the PR that I've got open, I think, is ready to go. So yeah, that would be welcome, but that would also be, I think, a breaking change, right? Currently valid schemas would become invalid if they use recursive defaults on input object fields. This PR doesn't, the way I've thought about it is this shouldn't, it doesn't require that, because effectively we would handle it in the same way that we would a runtime error. So if there were a recursive issue in the input, we would no, actually, I'm not sure that's true. Sorry, and forget that. I did think about it. There was a solution. I don't remember what it is offhand. Again, I'll pick Lee's brains.
Yeah, one thing to clarify, it's already mentioned reference implementation, and I think other implementation implemented it, and there is no like opposition. So we de facto already did a breaking change. And if you use JSON, this value is impossible to pass. It's mean like the only thing we can like potentially break is like formats that support like circular input objects, maybe like YAML support, like not every YAML parser supported, but de facto YAML support like anchors, so you can do that, but like most time YAML and JSON used interchangeably. So I would say like we de facto already, so yeah, it's like theoretical breaking change, but we de facto did it and nobody like objected for a year. So I would say like it's safe. Plus, I think like not only GraphQL.js, I think I saw inside PR, I saw like other implementation doing the same. I think like Ruby also did this change.
Well, that is great news. That makes things a lot simpler.
Yep, I think this, I was looking back on that one. Thanks for sharing the link, Yvonne. This is one that we had approved, but we wanted to have a waiting period before we merged it in. So, but you're right. That waiting period we should consider up and close this one out. It does seem like we want to be like extra careful, especially when working out the reference implementation of what Benji's proposing, just to make sure that there aren't cases where there's like nested default objects that either aren't being resolved correctly or result in infinite recursion. That was sort of the whole point of this previous proposal, was to avoid those things. So we should make sure that that's still the case. But I think that's the thing that we will figure out next before we move this one to stage 2. Cool. Okay. Action items. Benji.
Sorry, just finishing the notes. Okay, so I'll share my Firefox again. This one, I think. Yeah, cool. Okay, so we have some boards from various working groups from the past. So I'm going to start at the oldest one, and I think we can close a few of these. So we have an issue from the middle of last year saying schedule a GraphQL.org meeting. There's been epic progress on GraphQL.org recently, so I think this is no longer relevant. Would you agree, Lee? Yeah,
agreed.
Fantastic. Closing. Then there is writing up a vision for the code page. Equally, there has been epic progress on the code page. And I want to say brilliant progress, everyone who's been working on the GraphQL.org and the code page. I have seen so much activity around that. It's been really, really, really cool to see. So fantastic work, everyone. And I think that means that this is also no longer relevant.
Agreed.
Awesome. So you know what that means? That means that this whole one is no longer relevant. So we can close it.
Look at that.
Hooray.
Legacy
Good.
actions.
All right. So then we're on to May of this year. I've got 2 here that are ready for review. So update the input union RFC after recent subcommittee meetings. We did that. I've added the solution 7. There is probably still some notes in this issue itself, this actual working group issue, that has more notes on that, but I think we're probably as far as we're going to get on that. So I suggest we close it.
That sounds right. The intent there was when someone did come across that RFC, they would be seeing sort of the most up-to-date recommendation, and because we had made a lot of progress in those subcommittee meetings. So yep, agreed. This one's good to go. Thank you for that.
Okay, we also had add input union solution criteria that error messages are well specified. And I'm going to check that, but I think we
did that.
We have that. There we go. Yeah, it was this pull request 15 days ago. So I think that is, again, good to be closed. Yeah, you good to close that?
Yeah.
Lovely. And then we've got another one. I haven't marked this for closing, but introspection shortcuts describe the problem. Do you know if that was, I don't think that's been actioned yet, actually. Yeah, that's not been actioned yet, so we can ignore that. We'll go back to the rest. So then we'll look at 06. Did the GraphQL Scalars hosting scheduled call with Andy ever go ahead?
Not that I know of. I mean, Andy's here actually, so he would know best. But
we had a call together, remember?
I think we can close this one out. We filed this one because we started having a discussion about GraphQL Scalars, realized that particular meeting Andy wasn't able to join and wanted to follow up. So I think we can get this one done.
And we had a specific meeting as a follow-up.
Awesome. Well, you know what that means. That means that 06 can also be closed. That was 06, wasn't it? Yeah. 06 close. Hooray.
Woohoo.
07. None of these have been marked ready. So actually, I'm going to skip over to the ready for reviews. So let's look at just the ready for reviews and go with the oldest, which would be this one. People have got involved with the GraphQL Scalars project, I believe. So this is good to be closed.
I think so. Honestly, if we want something specific. Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think we can close it because I have not real actionable items to do for this. So yeah, let's close it.
Lovely. GitHub infrastructure for managing working groups. Yuri said, sorry, notifications. I think Yuri thinks that this is ready to be closed. I don't know what anyone else thinks about this, whether it's done or.
Yeah, like I initiate this issue. So idea was that we agreed every working group, different working groups will have separate repos. And it was question about GraphQL.js working group. So Uri helped with that and he created that repo. But what I think like issue was original is to create a template repo, not in like infrastructure, but a template repo, meaning like templates, README, and stuff. So you can easily fork it and run like find and replace some placeholder with the name of working group or something. And it's not done. That means like if we, for example, GraphQL.org, if we start GraphQL.org working group, we need to do cleaning up of a repo from the beginning. So I would say we're still looking for volunteer, and it's still like a relevant thing to do.
So should we leave this one open for now?
If we have like looking for volunteer badge, we can apply it there and ask if Uri wants to. Since
I would suggest closing this and in the future reopen something with something more specific. Because I'm dubious of separate repos for every subcommittee being the right thing, that we might want to just create a directory structure in the main WG repo so that if people show up here, they can find all of the various subcommittees that we have going on for JS, for HTTP. There's a bunch of stuff that we're doing. It'd be a nice thing to have one place that you can find them all.
Yeah, we discussed it actually. Like when I opened this issue, originally I opened this issue not as action item, but as a, because we have this rule that for adding agenda item, you need to have an issue to discuss it asynchronously. So, and we discussed it, and consensus, including Yuli, was that we create separate repos, because like different people have different commit rights. If we okay with giving like wide group of people commit right to main repo, it can work. We can live in separate directories. But if
I think having commit rights to more people in the working group repo is probably fine. Especially if those folks are like operating subcommittees, then presumably they're all trustworthy.
So just to clarify, so like GraphQL working group idea is to move it inside this working group repo, right?
I'd propose having a single repo for the working group and the subcommittees of the working group rather than separate repos. Before we make any specific changes, I think we should just have like a clear proposal about exactly what that's going to look like, so we don't miss something and break links somewhere or something like that.
Okay. One thing I can help with that, but I don't sure like for next meeting I will write this proposal. So if somebody have like idea to write it,
I can take a cut at that. I'll own that one.
Okay.
So maybe leave this one open and assign it to me.
Okay. I'll let someone else update that so that I can move on to the next one. Okay. Cool to organize the collaboration on TypeScript migration of GraphQL.js. I see there's been quite a lot of discussion, Ivan, on that. Are you happy that this one's been addressed now?
It's like Uri raised this question and we discuss it. So right now, two things happen. So we have like actual plan, updated plan. So previously we have like one, but we failed to execute. I failed to execute. I create a new plan and we discussed it. And we have like GraphQL.js working group. So I think like it's all like from two different directions. We have a place to discuss it and we have actual plan.
Fantastic. I'll go ahead and close that then. Yeah, I asked for people to review the query ambiguity pull request. They have done so. There has been plenty of feedback. So I think this one is done. Still needs work done on the query ambiguity pull request, but that's on me. But this particular issue, I think, has been dealt with So I'm going to go ahead and close that.
Awesome.
And this, we've already discussed this working group, was the Dunder type name on the subscription route. So I have written the PR spec and raised a pull request to GraphQL JS, but I need to talk to Ivan about that. But anyway, I believe that this is also closable.
Excellent.
Cool. And then there was an issue to update the defer and stream RFC with more thorough explanation of fragments versus fields, which Rob has said that he's done.
Amazing.
Close that.
I just marked it as ready for review.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, a minute ago. Yeah,
Snuck in
because
there,
yeah. So basically, it was a champion for this proposal, but he disappeared and stopped responding like PR. So we decided to adopt PR. And before this working group, I actually create a branch and create PR against like a spec. And as for GraphQL JS changes, it's already merged in. There is like some issues, like I think JavaScript specific issues with this feature, but it's merged and it's released, and like yeah, and so like there is a separate issue about updating a text, and I still need to close this, but this one I think is ready to close.
Okay, cool. I'll close that then. So that's it. All of our ready to review actions have been dealt with. So we do have still 23 open action items, but that now fits on one page of GitHub. So I want to call that a victory.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks for helping manage through that, Benji. Super appreciate. That's the last of our listed agenda. Anything else you'll want to cover?
Did we want to talk about scheduling an input union working group, or do we want to do that as a separate offline task? If so, Slack, may I suggest?
Yep, let's do that.
Another organizational issue, we need to change a password for this meeting to something with numbers and like special symbol. So a problem here is that so previously we used GraphQL and we still use GraphQL working group WG, but recordings, and previously it was the same password for recordings. So, but Zoom changed the rules, and our password for meeting doesn't satisfy them, but they applied it only on recordings. That means like when you try to access recordings, Zoom use like random generate password. So we need to either make it remove password from recording in general, or we need to update our password to satisfy Zoom rules. I would like advise to update password anyway, because like who knows what Zoom will change next month or before next working group. So something like with numbers. I don't know what number we should choose or what special symbol, but yeah.
All right, let's take that to Brian since he manages the Zoom account for us. And I'm sure he'll be able to, that way he can also make sure that it's represented correctly on all the meeting invites and stuff. I think that was also an issue. The meeting invite has a link to the Zoom, but does not have a link to the agenda and the password correctly. So we got to do a little bit of housework on making it easy to find those things as well. I'll take a note to discuss that with Brian.
Sorry
right.
to jump back like a minute, but we seem to have a little bit of time. Just going back to the schema call thing just for like 1 second. What are the, I was slightly unclear, sorry, I forgot to mention like who are the like dissenting opinions? Like who do I'm wondering how like I move forward basically, like who do I need to reach out to? Because
I think
I'm trying to like write down the notes.
Yeah,
Who,
I think we've got good notes there. And then I think it's pretty much just the folks that are already on that discussion thread.
Okay.
And we need to tease out there was some discussion about like how to set this up for good extension. And we'll just crisp up exactly what variant we want to roll with. But I suspect we can do that offline.
All right, well, I'll just continue in the thread then. All right, thanks.
All right, folks.
Quick note that,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, wanted a quick note that there are a couple of action items with nobody assigned to them, which is maybe fine, but feels a little counterintuitive. Don't know if those are things that are basically abandoned and we should just close, or whether they're kind of still free for the taking when somebody gets to them.
Some of them are like effectively assigned to everyone. So like looking over spec pull requests, for example, normally we need like as many people as possible to look at those and see what the issues are. So those don't tend to get assigned to specific people. I'm not sure if there's a good way of addressing that. It might be that maybe when we say that this needs review, we take a poll like hands up in the call and actually put those specific people on as assignees. But I think we also want people who aren't here at the call to do these reviews as well. So I'm worried that I don't want it to be like exclusionary from that regard. So I think it's acceptable to have them without people assigned, but I do think that they probably shouldn't be around for too long.
That's right.
I think it's a good idea to always have an owner. In the case that it is kind of on everybody, then maybe the assignee would be the person who would be accountable to deem that thing having happened. So it would be the champion for a proposal in the case that it's a proposal looking for feedback. Just so that we know who to ask if something is reasonably ready to close.
That seems a reasonable approach.
Some of these are also tactical, and we can probably assign to Brian.
Okay. No, I just wanted to raise the question. That sounds
cool.
Good.
I also closed one of the other projects after I stopped sharing because it turns out we'd finished that one as well. So we're down to one fewer project as well, which I quite like. How do you feel about the project system for managing these? I felt like it kind of groups them together by age quite nicely.
I'm not sure why
I
some
like
of
it.
them show a little green bar and some of them don't, but
I was just wondering that myself. I don't know.
It's a project setting in GitHub that you can set the project to track completion status. I'm just like, I'm surprised they didn't default to all the same thing if nobody's setting that on purpose. Makes it a little easier to notice when they're all done as well.
It is nice to have them kind of grouped like that and see progress, because sometimes it takes a while for the actions that pop up in a meeting to reasonably be completed. They're like long review cycles or follow-ups on RFCs, and it's nice to be able to track how many of those have actually made it through and how much is left.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to know that our oldest task at the moment is from the May working group, which, you know, it's only what, 7 months ago, so not too bad.
Yeah, not terrible. And that one is also, I don't know, maybe we want to have like a maximum life on some of these, because I think that one is assigned to someone who joined the call, talked through this problem. It was not super well clarified at the moment, and so the follow-up was to better describe the problem to advance the RFC. So
I think
it might be a case of a abandoned RFC.
I agree. I think if there's no response by next working group, we should close it in the next working group.
Yeah, that seems fine.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Benji.
All right. Well, with that, I'll call the meeting to a close. Thanks, everybody, for sticking through all of the meetings this year. We've made a ton of progress, despite the world being on fire around us. So I'll see you all in the next working group of next year.